Hurricane Harvey, Joe Arpaio, and military equipment for police. I'm Ulysses Campbell, and this is the Square Circle.
If you have a passion for helping people, want to launch a new charity, or need to raise funds, Voluntary Solutions can help. You have a passion for helping people. We have a passion for helping you. Visit voluntarysolutionsdc.com, 844-739-5488.
Hello, and welcome to the Square Circle. I'm your host, Ulysses E. Campbell. Joining us today are Karl Nelson of Intern Media, political commentator April Rain, and Kelley Vlahos of the American Conservative. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hurricane Harvey ravaged South Texas and Louisiana over the weekend, and in the aftermath, residents are left to cope with severe flooding and property damage. But in the midst of all the hardship, we've also seen many stories of altruism and neighbors helping each other. April, what do we take away from these horrible events of this disaster?
I think first and foremost, what we take away from what's happening with respect to Hurricane Harvey is that biology is more important than ideology. We are seeing people come together who may be of different races, different sexual orientations, different genders, different walks of life, different ideologies, and yet everyone is coming together as Texans to help each other out. So many of these videos, you will see an older white woman being saved by a younger black man. You will see, younger Latinx kids living and playing in shelters with other kids. And I think that's really wonderful. And it's something that we need to remember, even when times are not as hard and disastrous as they are right now, that we all have some commonalities in this country. And it would be better if we work together as one and find more common ground as opposed to our differences.
Pretty obvious when we have a disaster like that, that's the way it is. Karl, what do you think?
I completely agree with you. I think that this is the America that we want to see. You see strangers helping strangers, like you just mentioned. You see neighbors helping neighbors. You see law enforcement being there to protect and serve. It kind of makes me look at this racial divide that we have going on, and you have this tug of war between Democrats and Republicans, and it's kind of silly, especially when you turn on the television, you see what's taking place in Texas. 1/3 of Texas is pretty much underwater for the most part, right? So I have to piggyback off of what you said. I think that this is the America that when we stand up for that flag, right, this is what we want to see. We want to see unity. We want to see people come together no matter what background you come from, no matter what, race you come from. We just want to see people to come together, and that's what we're seeing in Texas, and I love that personally.
Kelley, what do you think?
Well, I think, the human story is incredible here. I'd like to take a look at the government story because as a reporter for many years in this town, I've covered 9/11 and the response and the policy and government response to 9/11, as well as Hurricane Katrina. And I've seen massive resources put into disaster response, and that's fantastic. But what we see each and every time are the limits to how well prepared we are as a government. And what I've been reading today is because of the way that Houston is laid out and the magnificent sprawl of the city, responders are having a difficult time getting to these flooded areas, and it's really testing the resources that we have. And I think it humbles us that government is not a panacea, and that no matter how much money you put in and how much training, and believe me, we're talking billions of dollars here, Mother Nature will challenge us, and it makes me feel that we aren't ready for anything, no matter how strong we may feel. That there's another surprise waiting around the corner, and I think that this will cause maybe some recalibration in how disaster response is thought out and planned, and it's just a constant challenge. So it's very interesting to watch from that perspective.
Now, I appreciate that perspective. Does anybody have any thoughts on another element to this story, which is apparently the fact that due to a lack of zoning regulation in Houston, that this problem potentially was worse than it could have been? I mean, I understand that there were areas that were paved over so that the water could not actually drain properly. It ran off into the bayous and added to flooding. Anybody have anything to add with that?
Well, I think that there are infrastructure issues with respect to every metropolitan area. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that Houston is unique in this particular instance. I take Kelley's point very well about the government's response and what it's going to look like. You know, if you talk about the federal response here, we just barely have a FEMA director, right? And there are other directors and placeholders that are still vacant under the Trump administration. And that's a real problem. What we also see is that Trump has said we're going to wait and see with respect to whether we're going to accept aid and assistance from the country of Mexico, right? And so we have Mexican people who are being told that they are rapists, right, by the president, who are being told that, that a wall is going to be built and they're going to pay for it. But yet they're offering their love, their resources, their money to us. And Trump is saying, well, we're not sure yet. Fortunately for the state of Texas, its governor has said, yes, in fact, we will accept some of the resources. And so the workaround that is required to go around Trump to get relief for American citizens is unfortunate, and it's something that should not be tolerated in this instance or in any other.
Well, not to contradict you, but I think it's worse here in Houston from what I've heard. And there was a chart that I saw where they talked about how much of these downtown areas have been paved over. There's a technical term for it that unfortunately I'm not familiar with, but let's go in another direction. And this is sort of building off of part of what you said, April, about the FEMA response. Now, I understand that there was a proposal several weeks ago in terms of how the load is shared in terms of disaster response. And what was proposed by FEMA was something that was also proposed under the Obama administration as far as the states bearing more of the burdens. How do we feel about that, especially in the light of what's happened here in Houston?
Well, I mean, it's all taxpayer money, and I'm not familiar with that proposal. But what I'm hearing here and what I've seen in personal experience is that each time you have an administration come in, you have the career, Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, or State Department, you name it, and then you have the political people who come in, and each administration brings in their political appointees, and there's this area of flux at this time of flux where you have specific appointments that aren't filled, and there are these gaps. And April's right. I mean, the gaps now have been lingering for some time. I have a friend who works in the Department of Homeland Security, and things were starting to settle in under General John Kelley, and then all of a sudden he was plucked out and put in the White House. Well, guess what? He brought a lot of people with him, so there were gaps there. FEMA is under DHS. They were absorbed into it after it was created after 9/11. So it's this smashing of the political and the practical, and it seems as though the political, and April mentioned Trump's response to Mexico, that's a political response, and there really should be no room for it here, but we see it in every disaster, whether it be Katrina or Andrew or 9/11 even.
Kelley, I don't want to cut you off, but we need to move on. And I'd also like to remind our viewers that you can submit your questions to our guests through our website, publicsquare.net, or via Facebook or Twitter. And we'll answer as many as we can live on air toward the end of the show. Now, also this week, President Trump defended his pardon of former Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Here's the story from Newsy.
Lawmakers and others are denouncing President Donald Trump's pardon of former Maricopa County, Arizona Sheriff Joe Arpaio. Trump issued his first presidential pardon Friday to Arpaio, who was found guilty of criminal contempt after his department ignored a court order to stop racial profiling practices. Arizona Senator John McCain said Trump's pardon, quote, undermines his claim for the respect of rule of law, as Mr. Arpaio has shown no remorse for his actions.
All right, so how do we feel about this pardon? Good thing or bad thing? Nelson?
I don't think it's a good thing, and the reason I do not think it's a good thing is if you look at this ex-sheriff's long history. He was a sheriff for 24 years. In that time, based on some research I was recently doing, he and his office actually had to put out about nearly $150 million in fees and settlements that were tied to things like police misconduct, abuse of power. You also had racial profiling situations too, and failure to respond properly to sex crimes, different things like that. So here you have a man who he did receive a pardon, but he's actually looking to also get his record expunged completely. He wants the judge to completely throw this conviction out. And I just don't understand what merit he could actually see that could come to pass, just given some of the long history of some of these things. And look, anytime you're putting out that type of money in terms of settlements and fees, it kind of screams some type of guilt.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. April, what do you think?
Well, I think that Trump jumped the gun on several issues here. Arpaio wasn't even sentenced yet. So we have no idea what that sentence was. So what are you really pardoning? What you're pardoning are all of the racist and intolerant and bigoted things that Arpaio did. And if we couple this with some of the other language that Trump has used that has been intolerant toward people of color, and what we saw his initial statement after Charlottesville, Virginia, and how many sides were violent, it sort of sets a pattern, right? He's telling a story with respect to how he feels about people of color. Pardons traditionally throughout the ages are used very sparingly and typically only at the end of a president's term. The fact that Trump is doing this in the first year, and specifically for Arpaio, who has not shown any remorse, who has not turned his life around, who has not become a better person and therefore worthy of something this strong as a pardon, really sets the tone. And there are many commentators who think that perhaps this is just a foreshadowing of future pardons that Trump may make from people that have been within his administration and perhaps his own children.
Mm-hmm. Kelley, anything to add?
No, I completely agree. I mean, let's look at what Arpaio did, or what he was convicted of. He was convicted of violating the constitutional rights of mostly Hispanic suspects in his county, in which he and his police department would just pull over people. They would have them arrested and then turn them directly over to immigration officials without charge of anything else. A judge said, you can't do that. He blatantly disregarded every warning to do that. He was arrested. He was, brought before a court. He disregarded. He went on Fox News and he bragged that that's what he was doing. And finally, this judge, without a jury, convicted him finally, and used much of his testimony, testimony being his interviews, his public interviews, bragging about what he was doing, against him. So what President Trump has done is he has pardoned an elected official for violating the due process constitutional rights of these individuals. And so I think there's going to be some appeal here by civil liberties groups who say, but the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, affords us due process. You can't just pardon elected officials because they didn't do or for not doing their job. So I think that's going to be very problematic down the road. Politically, I think this was just another instance of Trump basically telling his critics to F off. I mean, without better language, I'm sorry, but he's not the president that reaches across the aisle and says, listen, I know things are real tense right now after Charlottesville. Here is an olive branch. He's the one that reaches over and whacks his critics with the olive branch. And perceivably because he wants to shore up whatever base he has he has left. And he believes most likely that this base really would warm to this, and they love Arpaio, so this was a gift to them and a slap in the face to his critics.
Well, that's an important distinction that you made about the nature of what happened with this particular pardon, because, you know, ordinarily a presidential pardon, oh, you're golden, you're going to walk away. But the fact that certain rules were not observed in terms of historically what has happened with pardons, and then the point that you made about whether or not a president can actually issue a pardon under these circumstances where he is essentially controverting a court and the ruling of a court. You know, do we have anything that we want to talk about as far as add, just with regard to the unusual nature of that?
I'd like to add something. You know, I agree with the both of you guys. I think that there was definitely some personal investment here for the president. You know, Arpaio was actually an ally of the president during the campaign in 2016. And on top of that, he's very harsh in terms of his rhetoric on illegal immigration. So is the president. And in terms of border protection, so is the president. So there was some personal investment here as well, I believe.
Mm-hmm. All right, and finally, another story getting a lot of attention this week is the Trump administration's lifting of the ban on military weapons for local police. Here's Attorney General Jeff Sessions speaking to the National Fraternal Order of Police.
President Trump this day is issuing an executive order that will make it easier to protect yourselves and your communities. He is rescinding restrictions from the prior administration that limited your agency's ability to get equipment through federal programs, including life-saving gear.
All right, so Kelley, good thing, bad thing?
Well, it's very problematic. In 1997 rather, the military was afforded the ability to sell their surplus equipment to local police departments. This was right at the height of the Clinton cops program, where he was putting millions of dollars and 100,000 new cops out on the streets, and they were really bulking up, you know, with military-style equipment, really at the consternation of civil libertarians and others who saw this as the militarization of our local police departments. Why do they need MRAPs? Why do they need this extravagant body armor and weapons? Well, this just continued all the way through 2015 after the Ferguson protests, where like police looking like stormtroopers were going out in the streets. And it really made for bad optics and scared a lot of people. And then we already had the tension between the police and the citizenry. So President Obama put some limits on that. Not completely, but limits on the more prohibited items, which would be like the grenade launchers and the bayonets and the MRAPs. As you heard Jeff Sessions say, they're lifting the ban on the prohibited items. And what's problematic is that they're basically sending, he says, we're sending a message that we don't tolerate lawlessness. Well, for some people, that translates into dissent. And when you see all of this gear brought out on the streets on television, it is typically because of response to a protest. And I think civil libertarians are really concerned not only about the increase in the SWAT teams and the militarization there, but the militarization of protest response and dissent. What kind of message are they sending, and who are they sending it to? And so I think that we're turning a corner here, because I think to begin with, I think the military just wanted to get rid of their gear, and now it seems from what Sessions is saying is that it's being used to promote and militarize, and that's a whole different ballgame.
I think Kelley's exactly right. I mean, what she says, you know, this type of gear and this type of ammunition is going to be brought out for protests, but the question then becomes which protests, right? Because we saw in Charlottesville, there is a white nationalist, a white supremacist, who fired a gun into a crowd, and the police stood there and did nothing. But if you talk about the uprising in Ferguson, if you talk about the uprising in Baltimore, right, it was a demilitarized zone basically, and they were rolling in with tanks. Yet when we had the Women's March on Washington, women were in their little pink hats giving high fives to the cops that were on the street. So it only seems to be when black and brown people are protesting and looking for justice and equity that the cops roll in with this amazing amount of weapons weaponry. In addition, you can put that kind of militarized weapons on the streets, but are you bringing training with it? Because what we've seen so often is that cops will forget, oh, I thought I was holding my taser, but it turned out to be my gun, and so I've killed a young black man. You know, somehow my body camera didn't work, and so I'm not able to show what happened before I shot this young man in cold blood, right? So if they don't know how to use the weapons and the equipment that they already have, what is to say that they are going to be any better when they get this upgraded equipment?
Karl.
Yeah, might I add, you know, this is my fear with lifting this ban. My fear is, I think about 2014 in Ferguson. I think about the minority, you know, communities, and there's always been, especially in recent years, there's been this us versus them mentality, and it's very threatening to put, you know, military weapons, you know, and military equipment on the street corners of these communities. It just, to me, it just sends the absolute wrong message, and I think that it's not a message of us being together and us being there to protect and serve, but it's more so a threatening message. So I'm not a fan of it.
Thank you. We got to move on.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
It's a good topic.
Yeah, oh, indeed.
Yeah.
We could go much farther with that. But it's time to take some questions from our viewers. And so we are going to do that. And the first question we have comes from viewer Curtis McGuire, who asks, are Republicans being hypocritical for supporting help for Harvey victims while having opposed help for victims of Hurricane Sandy? Who wants to take that one?
Yes. I mean, next question. You know, I mean, they are, because the Texas Republicans voted down funding for Hurricane Sandy, and you know, and supposedly they're also for smaller government, right? And get out of my backyard, and you know, and we don't need your help. We'll just run it from the state. But now, when a disaster hits, they are asking for funds. Now, should they get it? Absolutely, because people are hurting. But we do need to call out the hypocrisy that we see. You know, if one part of the country should get it, then all parts of the country should get it. And we shouldn't play politics when lives are on the line.
I appreciate that. Okay. Our next viewer question comes from Lillian Parsons. Thanks so much for tuning in. Who asks, does the money providing military equipment to police cost taxpayer money?
Well, I mean, absolutely, because, well, we all paid for the military equipment, gear, and the weapons to begin with. So we paid for all of this. It's just going somewhere else at this point. From what I understand, the police departments are buying this, so that means the taxpayers from whatever county or local police department, you know, are paying, I guess, double. So it's kind of like a double dipping situation, which says to me that more people should be paying attention to this. If you're angry about the militarization of police, remember you're paying for it, so you should say something about it to your local officials when this comes up at local county meetings, because it will. It's in the budget, so you can say something.
Well, and I appreciate that too, because I've always believed one of the obligations of citizenship is to educate oneself to the issues. So by all means, please do that. Okay, now it's time for the most underreported story of the week. And who'd like to start?
I'll take that one.
Right.
My most underreported story of the week is, we're going to go back to Hurricane Harvey, but I'm going to go to the businesses that are exploiting these people who are suffering, who are without shelter, some people who are even losing their lives, right? So cases of water, I don't know if you guys have heard about this week, and it's something that I can't believe is not in headlines more, but cases of water are being sold for up to $99 per case. I get cases of water for less than $4 a pop. Gas, $4 to $10 for gas, for a gallon of gas. And I just think that's horrible. That's a horrible thing to do in a time of distress like this for those people.
Okay. Since I'm facing this
Okay.
way.
Well, the Pentagon admitted this week that we really have 11,000 troops in Afghanistan, when all the way up until this point for years now, since I've been reporting, it's been 8,500. So they've admitted there's more troops in Afghanistan than they had recently acknowledged. And now we're asking for several thousand more. They will not acknowledge how many are in Syria or Iraq. So this is an ongoing game that the Pentagon plays. They don't have to reveal the numbers. They're very secretive about them, but it is a shell game in terms of like they have, they'll say they'll have 100 here, 100 there, and we never really know how many. And it could be more than we are as a people comfortable with, but we just.
Thank you, Kelley. All right. April, what's your underreported story of the week?
We've talked about Hurricane Harvey a lot, but there are massive floods happening around the world. So Sierra Leone, they have lost over 1,000 people. India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and other Southeast Asian countries are also suffering, and we're not hearing about that. I think part of that has to do with the xenophobia of this country, right? We're only focused on ourselves, but the infrastructure problems that we talked about in Houston are also happening. There are mass graves in Sierra Leone where people are having to go to these graves, travel hundreds of miles, sometimes on foot, to find their loved one, and push other corpses aside to see if their loved one is underneath that person. And so, as we think about donations and helping Houston area victims, we also need to think about what's going on worldwide and also have conversations about climate change, because there's a reason why all of these floods are happening in the same part of, the same amount of time. All of these have happened within the past month. That is not a coincidence, and we need to do something in this country and worldwide, or it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Well, and we're part of a world community is what it is too. So, all right, that's all for this week. I'm Ulysses E. Campbell. Thanks for watching The Square Circle. We'll see you next week.